The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1936, and it changed everything. Not immediately, not the way a thunderclap changes things sudden and overwhelming and impossible to ignore. It changed things the way a crack changes a dam slowly at first, invisibly, until the moment when everything that had been held back finally broke through, and there was no stopping it, and there had never been any stopping it. Silas Pruitt read the letter aloud. He was the kind of man who believed that bad news delivered in public was easier for everyone involved because the presence of witnesses made it harder for the person receiving the news to react in any unseemly way. He stood at the front of the dormitory common room with the letter in one hand and his steel gray hair combed flat against his skull and his permanent expression of mild disgust arranged on his face like a fixture, and he read. The letter was from a lawyer in Hazard, Kentucky. It informed one Willa Callum, age 15, currently residing at the Coal Creek Home for Foundling Girls, that her maternal uncle, one Fergus Callum, had died on the 14th of February and had left to her as his sole surviving heir the following one-sealed limestone cave and the surrounding 16 acres of hollow land in Shadow Hollow, Harlan County, Kentucky. There were 23 girls in the common room that morning. Willa had counted them without meaning to the way she counted everything automatically and precisely because counting was a way of organizing a world that rarely bothered to organize itself on her behalf. All 23 laughed, not all at the same moment. It started with two girls near the window, then spread like fire across dry grass until even the youngest ones, the ones who still cried themselves to sleep some nights, the ones who had not yet fully understood that crying changed nothing, were laughing. They laughed with the particular energy of people who are relieved that someone else has become the object of ridicule. They laughed because it was easier to laugh at Willa Callum than to think about their own futures. They laughed because misery loves company. And Willa's misery for this one moment was funnier than anything any of them had encountered in months. Pruitt folded the letter with deliberate slowness. He had a way of folding documents that communicated his opinion of their contents, and this fold said, "This letter is beneath the dignity of serious consideration." He looked at Willa over the tops of his reading glasses with the eyes of a man who has decided everything worth deciding about a person and is no longer interested in new information. A hole in the ground, he said, for the girl nobody wanted. He paused to let the laughter swell around the words. "Perfect," he said. The laughter bounced off the bare walls. It bounced off the iron bed frames and the frosted windows that let in more cold than light, and the bare wooden floor that creaked in 3 specific places that Willa had memorized in her first week, because knowing where the floor made noise was the kind of knowledge that mattered in a place like Coal Creek. Willa did not look at the floor. She did not look at the other girls. She looked at Silas Pruitt directly and without flinching, with the dark eyes that people sometimes called insolent, and that were not insolent at all. They were simply the eyes of a person who was paying attention and had decided not to pretend otherwise. She was 15 years old. She had been at the Coal Creek Home for Foundling Girls since she was 5 years old, which meant she had spent 10 years in a place where she had been taught that the appropriate response to humiliation was silence and gratitude. She had learned the silence. She had never managed the gratitude. Pruitt threw the envelope at her that evening. The other girls had gone to supper. Willa sat on her cot in the long room she shared with 11 other girls, and she turned the envelope over in her hands and felt the weight of it. It was thick paper, expensive paper. The kind she had never touched before, not in 10 years of living in a place where nothing was wasted and nothing was given that wasn't necessary. Inside was the letter from the lawyer, which she had already heard, but there was something else. A small piece of paper folded twice tucked beneath the letter like a secret that had been carefully concealed. The handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, as if written by a hand that understood it didn't have much time left and was trying to say too many things at once. It said, "They will tell you that nothing grows in the dark. They are wrong. Come find my journal. Never trust Byrne." Willa read those words 3 times. She did not know who Byrne was. She did not know what journal her uncle meant or why he had felt the need to warn her about a man whose name she had never heard. She did not know what it meant that a man she had never met had apparently been thinking about her, leaving messages for her, shaping the terms of his death around the possibility that she would one day come to claim what he had left. What she knew was simpler and more important than any of that. She knew with the particular certainty that comes to people who have been told all their lives that they are nothing and who have spent those lives quietly disagreeing that this letter was meant for her. That somewhere in those mountains, a man had believed she could be more than what Cold Creek said she was. A man who had never seen her face had somehow known she existed and had decided that knowing was enough. She slept with the note folded inside her pillowcase. She left 3 days later before dawn, while the other girls were still sleeping. Pruitt didn't try to stop her. She could see the relief in his face when she appeared in his office doorway with her canvas bag over her shoulder, and the relief told her more about what she had meant to this place than anything he had ever said to her directly. She had always been the inconvenient one, the one who asked why they weren't taught mathematics past the 6th grade level, the one who wanted to know why the girls of Cold Creek received Bible verses and silence, while other girls received futures, the one who looked at the world and refused to accept that this was all there was. Now she was someone else's problem. Except there was no one else. There was just Willa and a note in a cave she had never seen. She packed everything she owned into the canvas bag. It didn't take long. 2 blouses, both patched at the elbows, 1 extra pair of stockings. The books she had accumulated over 10 years of careful acquisition, 5 of them taken from donation bins and church basements, and the one time a university professor had visited Coal Creek and left his briefcase unattended for 8 minutes in the front hallway. A photograph of her mother, small and slightly faded, taken on some summer afternoon before everything went wrong. She thought about saying goodbye to someone. She stood in the dormitory doorway for a moment and looked at the sleeping shapes in their beds and understood that there was no one to say goodbye to. Not because she had been cruel to any of them or they to her cruelty in a place like Coal Creek was mostly too exhausted to bother, but because the kind of friendship that was worth a proper goodbye required a kind of attention that neither she nor anyone else at Coal Creek had ever been able to spare. She walked out into the dark. The bus ride to Hazard took most of a day. The lawyer who met her at the station was a thin man named Pemberton, with kind eyes behind thick glasses and the careful manner of someone who had delivered difficult news so many times that he had learned to wrap it in gentleness before handing it over. He drove her 35 miles into the mountains in a truck that rattled and wheezed on every hill, the engine sounding like it was conducting a private argument with itself about whether the journey was worth completing. The road turned to dirt. The dirt turned to ruts. The ruts turned to something that was more suggestion than road a general direction through the forest, where people had been passing for long enough that the trees had learned to lean away. They climbed through stands of oak and hickory and pine so dense that the sunlight came through in coins dappled and golden and strange. Past the ghosts of old coal camps where the buildings stood empty, and the silence had the specific weight of places that had been used up and left. Your Uncle Fergus lived in this hollow alone for 45 years, Pemberton said. He was particular. People in town thought he was strange. He studied things, plants, minerals, underground water. He wrote letters to universities that mostly went unanswered. He paused, his hands tightened on the steering wheel. When he died, he said quietly, "Nobody came to the funeral except me." He let that sit for a moment. Let Willa understand what it meant. Her uncle had died alone, been buried alone, had lived his entire life in this valley without a single witness to what he had built until now. Pemberton handed her a rusted key and pointed to the far side of the clearing where the truck had stopped. There, half hidden by rhododendron and wild grape, was a wooden door set into the rock face of a limestone ridge. The door was weathered gray, its wood cracked and worn by decades of mountain weather, but the frame around it was solid cut from stone with more care than anything else visible in the hollow. "There's something else you should know," Pemberton said before she could move toward it. He told her about Aldrich Byrne, a man who owned 4 coal operations in Harlan County, a man who had wanted to buy this land for 25 years, who had made her uncle offers of increasing generosity and decreasing patience, and who had been refused every time. A man who believed there was a significant coal seam running beneath these hills, and who did not, in Pemberton's careful assessment, take refusal well or forget it quickly. Willa nodded. She filed the name in the part of her mind where she kept the things she didn't yet know how to use. She was halfway across the clearing when she found the dog. She almost didn't see him. He was in a shallow depression at the edge of the track, mostly concealed by a tangle of dead vegetation, and his coloring, what she could see of it beneath layers of caked mud, was close enough to the color of the winter ground that he blended in the way that animals sometimes blended in when they were too exhausted to do anything else. She saw the eyes first. They were open, watching her approach, and they were the color of creek water over dark stone, alert in a way that the rest of him was not. Everything else about the animal said this is a creature at the end of something. The ribs visible through the matted fur, the dried blood on one foreleg where a wound had closed but never properly healed, the complete absence of the energy required to flee. But the eyes said something different. The eyes said, I am still here. Willa stopped. She had half a biscuit in her coat pocket left over from the bus station where she'd bought it with the last coins from the small amount of money she'd managed to save at Cold Creek. She'd been rationing it. She was not entirely sure when she would next have access to food. She took it out and knelt down in the mud and held it out. The dog's nose twitched. He lifted his head slowly at the cost of visible effort, and then he crawled toward her with the careful determination of an animal that has learned that hope is expensive and is spending it anyway. He took the biscuit from her hand with a gentleness that was startling. His teeth were soft against her fingers. His eyes the whole time never left her face. She sat with him for a long time. She talked to him, though she wouldn't have been able to say afterward exactly what she said. Maybe about Cold Creek, maybe about the note in her pillowcase. Maybe just the simple truth that she understood what it felt like to be the thing that everyone had decided wasn't worth stopping for. When the sun began to sink behind the ridge and the shadows grew long across the hollow, she picked him up. He weighed almost nothing, just bones and fur and a heartbeat that refused against all available evidence to give up. She carried him the rest of the way. She named him Flint, because when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that wouldn't go out, a spark that kept burning despite everything that had tried to extinguish it. She understood that spark. She had been carrying her own version of it for 15 years. The cabin that stood beside the cave entrance had been built to last and had lasted, though just barely. It was small, 15 feet by 20, a single room that served as kitchen and bedroom, and everything else with walls of hand-hewn logs and a roof of wooden shingles, many of which had rotted through or gone missing in the years since anyone had maintained them. Inside was worse. The wood stove was cracked down one side, the iron split as if it had frozen and thawed too many times and finally run out of patience with itself. Mice had made nests in the mattress. The windows were so filmed with age that the light coming through them had the color and quality of old tea. Willa set Flint down on the cleanest section of floor and stood in the middle of the room and looked at what she had, which was a dying cabin in a sealed cave and 16 acres of mountain wilderness, and not a single person within miles who knew she existed. She found some ancient jars of preserved beans in the root cellar. Half of them had gone bad, their lids swollen with the pressure of whatever was happening inside the smell when she opened one enough to make her eyes water. The other she ate cold standing at the cellar stairs because she was hungry and there was nothing else. And she had learned years ago that pride was a luxury best reserved for situations where you were not genuinely hungry. She fed Flint from a jar, mashing the beans between her fingers until they were soft enough for him to manage. The first night they slept on the least damaged portion of the floor, Willa wrapped in her blanket and Flint pressed against her side, his heartbeat steady against her ribs. The second night it snowed. Not a suggestion of snow, a real mountain snow, heavy and wet and serious, the kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't make apologies. It fell all night in silence, piling up against the cabin walls, and Willa woke at 3 in the morning to water dripping through the roof onto her face and the wood stove dead because the firewood she'd gathered was green and wouldn't hold a flame. She struck match after match. Each one sputtered and went out. The coal pressed through the walls and through the floor and through the thin wool blanket and through everything she had brought with her, and there was nothing she could do about it. She lay in the dark with her teeth knocking together and her thoughts going in directions she'd worked hard not to let them go. This is how I die, she thought. Not from cruelty, not from injustice, but from cold and silence and the indifference of the mountains to one girl's survival. Flint pressed himself harder against her side. His body heat was small, but it was real, a physical fact in a situation that was running out of physical facts she could rely on. His heartbeat was steady. Steadier than hers. She thought about going back. She thought about Pruitt's oatmeal and the dormitory's thin warmth and the certainty of a life she understood even though she hated it. She thought about how warm the laughter had been compared to this. She thought about whether her uncle's note had been a gift or a curse. And then as the gray dawn finally reached through the gaps in the roof and the snow stopped falling and the wind settled into something quieter, she dragged herself to the table and opened the journal. It was on the table where it had been since she arrived, where Pemberton must have left it, and she had been too cold and too tired and too overwhelmed to open it before now. It was thick as a Bible bound in cracked leather, held together with a strap that had been repaired so many times the repairs had become part of the strap's identity. The pages were yellowed, covered in handwriting so small and precise she had to squint to read it. On the cover in careful letters, notes on the cultivation of life in darkness. Fergus Callum, 1891 to 1935. 44 years of work. 44 years of observations and experiments and discoveries written down in the same careful hand from the first page to the last, the handwriting never changing its precision, even as it slowed slightly in the later years when age was making its demands. She opened to the first page. The entry was dated 1891. Fergus Callum had been 17 years old when he started this work, barely older than she was now, alone in the same hollow with nothing but curiosity and stubbornness and time. He wrote about his father, her grandfather, who had survived the famine in Ireland by growing things in a cellar no deeper than a grave. Knowledge passed from father to son across an ocean. Knowledge that had kept a family alive when thousands around them were dying. And now from uncle to niece. She sat in that freezing cabin holding a dead man's journal, and she felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not yet hope, was too expensive for the state she was in. But the absence of despair, which when you are 15 and alone in the mountains with a sick dog and a ruined roof and no food is almost the same thing. In the morning she opened the cave. The key fit the padlock with the protesting complaint of metal that had not moved in a long time. She worked it back and forth, patient and methodical, until she heard the click of the mechanism releasing, and then she put her shoulder against the door and pushed. It opened inward with a groan that was part wood and part memory. Cold air came out, not the sharp cutting cold of the outside world, but something different, something stable and ancient. The breath of the earth itself coming up from a depth where surface weather had never reached. She lit the kerosene lantern she'd found hanging on a peg by the door, and she stepped inside. And then her legs gave out. She didn't fall. She went down slowly under control, the way a person went down when the mind was still functioning, but the body had decided that standing was not the appropriate response to what the eyes were reporting. She was kneeling on a stone floor holding the lantern with both hands, and she was looking at something that should not have existed. The cave's main chamber was roughly 60 feet wide and 15 feet at its highest point, with limestone walls that glistened in the lamplight as if the stone itself were breathing. The natural floor had been leveled and divided into raised beds of stacked stone, each bed about 3 feet high and filled with dark, rich soil, the kind of soil that smelled the way growth smelled, like possibility made physical. But that wasn't what had brought her down to her knees. Along the ceiling, and she had to look twice and then a third time to be certain she was seeing what she was seeing, her uncle had installed a series of mirrors. Glass mirrors, some cracked, some clouded with age, mounted on wooden frames that were hinged in adjustable position to catch the light that came through a narrow natural chimney near the entrance and redirect it, bounce it, send it traveling deeper into the cave in a cascade of soft, diffused illumination that reached all the way to the back wall. During the hours when the sun hit that chimney at the right angle, the cave would glow with a light that was nothing like daylight and was entirely sufficient for growing things. Her uncle had calculated it. He had measured it and adjusted it and refined it over 44 years of careful observation, and what he had arrived at was a system that made light go where light had no business going. The temperature underground stayed nearly constant. She learned this from the journal later, though she could feel it now. Not the 55 degrees Fahrenheit she would eventually measure, but the unmistakable sense of stepping from a world of extremes into a world of stability. The cave didn't freeze. It didn't bake. It simply held steady and patient, a temperature that was too cool for summer crops, but warm enough for everything else. Warm enough for lettuce and spinach and leo and turnips and radishes. Warm enough for mushrooms. Warm enough for herbs whose smell she couldn't identify, but that filled the chamber with something complex and alive. Warm enough for life. A series of stone channels ran along the base of the cave walls, directing the natural water seepage into a collection pool at the back of the chamber, from which smaller channels carried it through the raised beds in a slow, continuous flow. The limestone itself was leaching calcium and other minerals into the water as it moved, creating a natural supplement that her uncle had documented in exhaustive detail in his journal. The plants in these beds had been getting fertilized by the mountain itself without anyone doing anything to make it happen. The beds were empty now. Whatever Fergus had last grown had died in the years since he stopped tending them. The soil was dark and dormant and waiting. But the infrastructure was there. All of it. The mirrors, the water channels, the stone beds, the patient engineering of a man who had spent 4 decades turning a geological accident into something that could sustain human life. She sat on the cave floor with her lantern, and she looked at what her uncle had built, and she cried. Not from sadness, not from relief exactly, from the overwhelming and completely unfamiliar sensation of being recognized. Someone had built this. Someone like her. Someone the world had called strange. Someone who studied and questioned and refused to accept that the world is given was the world as it had to be, had been here before her in this exact hollow, and had spent his entire life creating proof that the conventional wisdom was wrong. Nothing grows in the dark. They are wrong. She was still holding the journal. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, and she opened it to a page near the middle, and she began to read in earnest. The system made sense to her immediately. Not all of it. Some of the calculations were beyond what she'd been able to teach herself, and some of the botanical knowledge required more background than her stolen textbooks had provided, but the fundamental logic of it was clear from the first pages she read. Light plus constant temperature plus mineral-rich water plus good soil. Remove any one of those 4 elements and you had nothing. Maintain all 4, and you had a farm that could operate when everything above ground had given up. She spent the rest of that day in the cave, reading and exploring, touching the stone walls and the empty beds, and the mirror frames with the careful hands of someone cataloging an inheritance they don't yet fully understand but intend to. Flint lay at the cave entrance, in the warmth where the inside air and the outside air met, and watched her with those creek-water eyes. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her life, and also in a way she wouldn't be able to articulate for years the first weeks of her actual life. The line between those two things was thin enough that she sometimes couldn't find it at all. She foraged. The mountains in late March offered food to those who knew where to look, and she had read enough to know where to look, even if the reality of doing it was colder and more humbling than the reading had been. Ramps with their sharp garlic smell appearing in patches on the south-facing slopes. Dandelion greens bitter but edible. Fiddlehead ferns that tasted like something between asparagus and the memory of asparagus when you cook them long enough. Wild strawberries, tiny and intense, that she ate too fast on the first day and made herself sick. She lost weight she didn't have to lose. Her clothes hung on her. There were mornings she woke too dizzy to stand, her vision blurring at the edges, and she sat on the edge of her cot and breathed through it and stood up anyway, because the alternative was not standing up, and that was not something she was going to do. Flint's leg healed slowly. The wound closed over and the limp faded until he walked almost normally. He was thin still, but less alarmingly thin, and his energy was returning in the cautious, incremental way of something that has been very close to gone and is not entirely sure yet how far back it can come. He began hunting. Rabbits mostly, and once a squirrel, and once memorably a groundhog that was nearly as large as he was, and that he dragged across the cabin floor with his tail wagging, in the specific way of a dog who knows he has done something extraordinary and wants appropriate credit. She cooked what he brought, and they shared it without ceremony, because they had established early that ceremony was a luxury, and they were not in the luxury business. She followed the journal like a manual. She repaired the mirrors system first, replacing the 2 most damaged pieces with sheets of polished tin she hammered from flattened cans, rubbing them with sandstone until they caught and threw light with reasonable efficiency. She cleaned the water channels, scraping years of mineral buildup out with a knife, working section by section until the water ran steady and clear through all the beds. She tested the soil and found it exactly as the journal had described, dark, alive, dense with the microorganisms that Fergus had cultivated over decades of careful amendment. When she held it in her hands, it smelled like something that had been waiting. She planted cold-tolerant crops first. lettuce, spinach, kale, turnips, radishes. Seeds she had bought with the small amount of money the estate had included, just enough to begin. She planted them in the clay pots she found on the shelves, set them on the warmest shelves near the back wall where the stone held its heat most reliably, and she waited. 6 weeks after planting, she harvested her first lettuce. It was pale, lighter green than sun-grown lettuce, the color of something that had learned to do without what everyone said it needed, but it was crisp and real and alive. She stood in the cave holding a head of lettuce she had grown underground in a place where nothing was supposed to grow, and she felt something that she had been waiting 15 years to feel. Not joy, not yet. Something quieter and more durable than joy. She felt like herself. Summer came to the hollow in its own time, indifferent to what was happening inside the cave and inside the girl who was learning to tend it. The world outside continued its business. The creek ran, the trees leafed out, the birds returned and argued with each other about territory from dawn to dusk. Willa worked. She expanded the planting. She replanted the stone beds one by one as she learned their individual characters, which ones caught more light, at which angles, which ones drained faster, which ones were warmest at what times of day. She was in the cave on the morning of the day Aldrich Byrne came. Flint's warning was not a bark. It was a sound she had never heard from him before, low and continuous, and coming from somewhere below normal pitch, the sound of an animal whose instincts have identified something that its previous experience has not equipped it to handle. Not a threat it knew how to categorize. Something it knew in the ancient wordless way that animals knew things required a different kind of attention. She came out of the cave to find a black automobile parked beside the cabin. It was the most out-of-place thing she had ever seen. In a hollow where nothing was new and everything was worn, and the newest vehicle she had seen since arriving was Pemberton's rattling truck. This automobile was as incongruous as a cathedral. It was sleek and black and shining in the morning sun, and it had not been troubled by the road, which meant the person who owned it was accustomed to troubling roads into compliance. The man standing beside it was perhaps 50 broad through the shoulders, dressed in a suit that fit the way suits fit when they have been made specifically for the body wearing them. His hair was silver, swept back from a high forehead. His hands were in his pockets in the studied casual manner of a man who wants to appear relaxed and has learned all the external signals of relaxation without ever actually achieving the condition. His eyes were the color of creek water in the shade, gray-green and very cold. He smiled when he saw her. It was a practiced smile, the kind that had been developed over decades of negotiations and refined by the specific discovery that smiling at people who had something you wanted made them feel briefly as though the power in the situation was distributed more equally than it was. "Willa Callum," he said. His voice was smooth, the accent of a man who had grown up in these mountains and spent 30 years sanding the mountains out of his speech. "I'm Aldrich Byrne. I own some operations in the county. Thought I'd come introduce myself to my new neighbor." He looked around the hollow with an expression of polite assessment, and he looked at the cabin and at the cave entrance with its weathered door and at the ridges rising on all sides, and he looked the way a man looked at things he was calculating the value of. "Beautiful land," he said. "Shame to waste it on a garden." Willa said nothing. Byrne reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. He held it out between two fingers casually, the way you might hold out something you were offering to do someone a favor by taking off their hands. $300, he said. "Take it. Go to the city. You're young, you're smart, I can see that already, and this is no place for a girl alone. Your uncle spent 45 years out here and died with nothing but a bush and a hole in the ground. Take the money, make something of yourself." Willa looked at the envelope. She thought about what $300 could buy. A room somewhere warm, food that didn't come from the forest, clothes without patches, a future that didn't involve learning alone and from a dead man's notes how to grow vegetables in a cave. She thought about the words on the small piece of paper she had carried in her pillowcase from the moment she received it. "Come find my journal. Never trust Byrne." She thought about the pale head of lettuce she had held in her hands 3 weeks ago and the feeling that had come with it. She looked up from the envelope. "No," she said. The word was not loud. "Adidisham." It didn't need to be loud. It was the single syllable of a person who has considered the options and reached a conclusion and does not need an audience for the reaching. Something moved in Byrne's face. It was subtle, the kind of movement that a person only caught if they were paying the kind of attention that Willa had been paying to the world since she was 5 years old, and had learned that the world did not announce its intentions. The practiced smile didn't disappear. But behind it, something changed. Something that had been arranged into a shape it was not naturally comfortable holding relaxed slightly into its actual form. Your uncle said the same thing, Burns said. His voice was still smooth, still polite. But the politeness now had the specific quality of a surface that you knew from the sound it made when you tap, and it was hollow underneath. You know what happened to him? He died alone, Willa said. Byrne looked at her for a long moment with those cold creekwater eyes. This land will be mine, he said quietly. One way or another, I'm a patient man, but I always get what I want. He got back in his car. He drove away. The automobile navigated the ruts and the rocks with the ease of something that was accustomed to getting where it was going despite the terrain, and then it rounded the far bend in the track, and the sound of the engine faded, and the hollow was quiet again. Flint stood at Willa's side. The low sound had stopped. He was watching the place where the car had been with the focused attention of an animal that was not yet certain the threat had actually departed. Willa put her hand on his head. She went back inside and she read by lamplight until she found the passage she was looking for. It was in a section of the journal dated 1911, 25 years back, written in the same careful hand, but with a different pressure. The letters formed with the tightness of a man writing under circumstances that required steadiness and were not producing it naturally. Burns sent men to burn my cabin last night, her uncle had written. I escaped through the back chamber, the one with the second exit that comes out on the ridge above. They don't know it exists. They think I'm dead. I will let them think so for as long as it helps me. I will not leave this place. I have spent 20 years building something here that the world does not believe is possible, and I will not surrender it to a man who cannot see past what the ground is worth to someone who wants to dig it up. But if you are reading this, niece, whoever you are, whenever you are, know that Aldrich Byrne is not a man who forgets what he wanted. He will come for you as he came for me. He will come with money first and with other things after. The cave is your fortress. The stone has stood for longer than any of this trouble. Stay, grow, and when he comes, and he will come, let the mountain be your answer. Willa closed the journal. Outside, the spring night was settling into the hollow with its usual business of frogs and creek sound and the wind moving through the first leaves of the season. Flint had come to lie against her side, his heartbeat steady, his eyes half closed, but still watching. She thought about Pruitt's face when she had stood in his office doorway with her bag and the relief that had been visible in it. She thought about 23 girls laughing in the morning, and a note folded small and tucked beneath a lawyer's letter, and the smell of soil in a cave where no one expected anything to grow. She thought about the pale head of lettuce and the feeling that had come with it. She picked up the journal again and turned to the next page. There was a great deal more to learn. The old man came down from the ridge on a morning in April when the redbud was blooming and the hollow smelled like something waking up after a long sleep. Willa was outside the cave digging a drainage channel with a spade she had found hanging on a peg inside when she heard the sound of boots on the slope above. She straightened up and turned and saw him coming through the trees with the deliberate care of a man who knew exactly how many useful years his body had left and intended to be thoughtful about spending them. He was tall, or had been tall once age had taken some of it, the way age took things, with a face like old leather and hands so knotted with arthritis that watching him grip his walking stick seemed like watching something remarkable. His lungs announced themselves with every step. A wheeze deep and persistent, the sound of air moving through passages that had been narrowed by decades of work in places where the air was not air, but a mixture of air and coal dust and the accumulated respiratory debt of a life spent underground. He stopped at the tree line and looked at her. Then he looked at the cave entrance, at the new drainage channel she was digging, at the small kitchen garden she had begun to establish in the patch of ground south of the cabin where the sun held longest. Then he looked at the smoke coming from the chimney she had repaired with clay and riverstone over the course of 2 days in March. You would be the one who got the chimney drawing again, he said. His voice was deep and carried the specific cadence of a man who had spent his life in these mountains and saw no reason to sand the mountains out of his speech the way some people did. He said it the way you stated a fact that you had been considering for some time and had finally decided to speak aloud. I've been watching the smoke for 6 weeks, he said. trying to work out who finally found this place. His name was Thaddeus Vane. He was 76 years old and he had lived alone in a cabin 3 miles up the ridge for the past 12 years since his wife had left and his son had moved to Detroit, and his lungs had made the mind's decision for him by becoming incompatible with further work underground. He had known Fergus Callum. He had been, as far as Willa could determine from what he told her in the weeks that followed, the only person in the valley who had not thought Fergus was crazy. He showed me once, Vane said. They were sitting on the porch of the communion in the thin April sunlight, Willa with her knees drawn up and the journal open across them. Vane with his hands folded around a cup of the mint tea she had grown from seeds found in Fergus's storage. Must have been 1923 or thereabouts. He had tomatoes growing in there in January, red and ripe and sweet as summer. He shook his head, not with disbelief, but with the specific motion of a man revisiting a memory he had carried carefully for a long time. I thought I was dreaming, he said. Thought maybe the dust had finally gotten to my brain. But Fergus just handed me one and I bit into it and it was real. He paused, cold and wet and real. He looked at Willa with the eyes of a man who had spent 50 years working in darkness underground and understood in a way that most people didn't what it meant to maintain life in a place that was not supposed to support it. You're just like him, he said. What Thaddeus Vane knew that Fergus's journal couldn't teach her was the mountain itself. The journal was meticulous on the cave and its systems. It was thorough on soil composition, on the behavior of the water channels, on the seasonal adjustments required for the mirror array as the sun's angle changed across the year. It was in the way of a man who had spent 4 decades becoming the world's foremost expert on a subject no one else had thought to study, comprehensive. But it did not know how to split wood. This sounds trivial. It was not trivial. Splitting wood efficiently, reading the grain, finding the natural line of separation, letting the axe do the work rather than fighting against the wood's own structure, was the difference between a cord of firewood in 4 hours and a cord in 8. In a hollow where every hour had competing claims, 4 hours was not a small difference. Vane showed her. He stood beside the chopping block and he explained with the patience of a man who had been doing this for 60 years and had reduced it to its essential principles. And then he watched her and corrected her and watched her again until she found the rhythm of it. His hand shook slightly now from the arthritis, and he could no longer swing an axe himself with the strength the work required. But he knew the theory precisely, and the theory was most of what she needed. He showed her how to read weather in the clouds, the specific formations that meant rain was 12 hours away versus 24, the color of the evening sky that predicted morning frost, the behavior of the birds when pressure was dropping. He showed her how to repair the cabin roof properly overlapping the shingles, so water ran off rather than finding its way through. He showed her which plants in the forest were medicine and which were poison, and which walked a complicated line between the two, depending on how much you used and how you prepared them. In exchange, she fed him fresh greens from the cave herbs she had grown from Fergus's carefully labeled seed packets, mushrooms from the back chamber where she had established a growing system, using the techniques the journal described. He said it was the best food he'd eaten in 30 years. He said this matter-of-factly, without sentimentality, the way he said most things. The mines took everything from me, he told her one evening. They were sitting on the porch as the fireflies began their work in the hollow below, blinking their quiet signals to each other in the gathering dark. His breath rattled in his chest as he spoke, the black lung making itself known with each word. My lungs. My wife, she left when the coughing got too bad. Said she couldn't watch me die slow. His son, he said, had not written in 8 years. He looked at the cave entrance where the last of the evening light was catching the edge of the mirror array inside and throwing a faint gold into the darkness beyond the door. But this, he said, he gestured at the cave, at the hollow, at the whole improbable system that Fergus had built and Willa was learning to tend. This is a mind that gives instead of takes. Flint was lying at Vane's feet. He had decided in the way that dogs decided things without apparent deliberation and with complete finality that the old man was acceptable. He lay with his head on Vane's boot and his eyes half closed, and the picture of it, the battered paw and the battered old man and the mountain and the fireflies and the faint gold light coming out of the cave was the kind of picture that Willa filed in the part of her mind where she kept the things she wanted to be able to find again. Elspeth Norris arrived in the September of Willa's second year. She came on a Thursday afternoon when the leaves were just beginning to turn at the highest elevations, and the air had the first suggestion of what was coming. Willa was inside the cave when she heard footsteps at the entrance, and she came out expecting Vane and found instead a woman she had never seen. She was perhaps 30, with wheat-colored hair pulled back in a practical braid, and the kind of direct assessing gaze that Willa recognized because she had been told all her life that it was inappropriate for someone in her position. The woman was dressed practically boots, not shoes, and a coat with actual pockets, and she was looking at the cave entrance with an expression not of wonder but of focused attention. "I heard about your cave," Elspeth said. She said it the way you said something you had been thinking about for weeks and had finally organized into its proper opening. "The Reverend calls it witchcraft. Mrs. Hawkins at the general store says you're in league with something she won't name in polite company." She looked at Willa directly. "But I've read about experiments like this," she said. "Underground agriculture, controlled environment farming. There have been attempts in Europe. The principles are sound, but the implementations I've read about were crude. I came to see what you've actually built." Her name was Elspeth Norris, and she taught science and mathematics at the school in Ember Hollow, the nearest town, which was 9 miles down the mountain. Her father had been a mining engineer from Sweden who had come to Kentucky in 1901 and spent his career trying to make the mine safer, which was the work of a man whose intelligence could see what should be done and whose position could not make anyone listen. He had died in a collapse in 1921 while attempting to rescue trapped workers, which was the kind of ending that said everything there was to say about the gap between what a man knew and what the world allowed him to do with the knowing. Elspeth had inherited his technical mind and his refusal to accept received wisdom without testing it against reality. She asked questions no one else had asked. Not about whether the cave was real, she accepted that immediately on the evidence of her own eyes. She asked about the angles. What was the current degree of inclination of the primary mirror relative to the horizontal? Had Willa adjusted it since she arrived, and if so, how had she determined the correct adjustment? What was the measured temperature differential between the front chamber and the rear? How did the water flow? Rate through the stone, channels vary across seasons, and had she documented it? Willa answered everything she could from the journal and from her own 2 years of observation, and she was honest about what she didn't know, because she had learned early that pretending to know things you didn't know was a luxury that people who actually needed things to work could not afford. Elspeth listened. She took notes in a small book she produced from her coat pocket. She moved through the cave with a measuring tape and a compass and a notebook, and she made calculations standing at the mirror array that Willa followed part way and then lost, but which she filed carefully for later study. When she had finished, she stood in the middle of the cave and looked at the mirrors and the beds and the stone channels and the mushroom logs stacked in the back chamber, and she said, "Your uncle was working with a mirror angle calibrated for the summer solstice. That's why the winter performance is suboptimal." Willa said, "What should it be?" The answer required glass, not the polished tin that Willa had used to patch the damaged sections of the array. Real glass, the kind that transmitted light rather than merely reflecting it at reduced efficiency, the kind that could be cut to precise dimensions and would maintain those dimensions over time. Elspeth came back the following Saturday with 4 panes of glass she had ordered from Louisville and a set of calculations she had worked out at her kitchen table over the intervening week. Together, Elspeth calculating and directing Willa climbing and positioning and making the final adjustments herself because it was her cave and her system, and she was not going to be a passive participant in its improvement. They reset the mirror array to an angle that would maximize winter solar gain at the specific latitude and elevation of Shadow Hollow. They finished on a November afternoon when the light was already going golden thin. The difference was immediate. The illumination that reached the back wall of the cave was not the soft, uncertain glow that Willow had been working with. It was something richer, more reliable light that moved through the space with actual purpose. The plants seemed to respond before she could have expected them to their leaves tilting incrementally toward this better version of what they needed. "Your uncle was a genius," Elspeth said. She was looking at the adjusted array with an expression that Willa had learned to recognize as Elspeth's version of wonder, which was a focused appreciation for elegant solutions to difficult problems. "But you," she said, "you're going to prove it. Every decision Willa made about the cave from this point forward, she made herself." Elspeth offered calculations and information and the particular kind of challenge that comes from someone who knows enough to ask the hard questions. But the decisions were Willa's. The direction was Willa's. The cave was hers, and the understanding of it was hers, and she was not going to mistake assistance for authority. This was important. She had spent 15 years in a place where decisions were made for her, about her, without the pretense of her input. And she had arrived at the position, not loudly, not as a declaration, simply as a settled fact about who she was, that she would not live the rest of her life that way. The people of Ember Hollow remained unconvinced. The Reverend Caleb Horn delivered a sermon in the early spring of Willa's second year that Thaddeus Vane reported to her afterwards, sitting on the porch with his hands curled around his cup, his voice tight with an anger that his control kept just barely managed. "The Lord said, 'Let there be light,'" Vane recited. The Reverend had said this with the theatrical pause of a man who understood how to deploy silence as emphasis. And there was light. But what grows where God's light cannot reach, what springs forth from darkness and shadow, he had let the question hang. "Nothing good," Vane said quietly. "That's what the man said. Nothing holy, and anyone who tells you different is either a fool or something worse." Mrs. Prudence Hawkins at the general store had made her position clear the first time Willa walked 9 miles to buy seeds. Large woman, small eyes, a mouth that had been shaped by decades of disapproval into something permanent. She had looked at Willa across the counter with the expression of someone who had already decided this conversation and was simply waiting for it to finish. "I don't sell to witches," she said, "and I don't sell to fools. Your uncle was both." She pointed at the door. "Get out of my store." Willa had walked 9 miles back to the hollow, empty-handed. She had not on the long walk back allowed herself to be diminished by it. She had thought about the journal and about the lettuce in January and about Thaddeus Vane saying that she was just like him, her uncle, the man the town had decided was crazy and who had spent 44 years being right. She had thought about what it meant to be right in a place that didn't want you to be right and whether the rightness was diminished by the refusal. It was not. The summer of 1938 was the hottest Vane said he could remember. The hollow held the heat the way hollows did, the surrounding ridges acting as walls that kept the air close and still, and the cave became increasingly important as the only genuinely cool space in the valley. She began sleeping inside it on the worst nights, lying on a bed of pine boughs near the back wall, where the temperature stayed in the mid-50s even when the air outside was close to 90. Flint slept beside her. He had adapted to the cave with the pragmatism that characterized his approach to most things, treating it as simply another territory to learn and maintain. The night of August 11th, he woke her at midnight, not with barking, with a low, continuous sound she had learned to recognize as the signal for a category of threat that his ordinary warning system didn't know how to handle. She was fully awake before she had consciously decided to be sitting up on her pine bough bed with her hands flat on the ground and her ears finding the dark around her. Flint was at the cave entrance. The sound from him was unbroken. She could see his silhouette against the lesser dark of the open doorway. The fur along his spine raised his whole body pointed outward at something she couldn't yet detect. Then she smelled it. Smoke. Not the familiar wood smoke of her stove. Something different. Something that carried in it the smell of things burning that were not meant to burn, treated wood-stored cloth, the chemical edge of lamp oil catching on material that was too dry after months of summer heat. She had 30 seconds, maybe less. She grabbed the journal from the ledge beside her bed, where she kept it always within arm's reach, because she had known, without being told, that the journal was the one thing she could not replace, the one record of what her uncle had built and thought and understood that existed anywhere in the world. She pulled on her boots and she ran. The cabin was already going when she came through the cave door. The back wall was fully involved, the flames climbing the old dry logs with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The fire had found the chimney and was using it, the draw, pulling the heat upward and feeding it and making it larger with every second. She stood in the clearing with the journal under one arm and Flint beside her, and she watched the cabin her uncle had built die. She did not try to save it. There was nothing to save. The tools and the seed packets and the extra clothing she had acquired and the 5 books she had carried from Coal Creek and the photograph of her mother, all of it was in there, and all of it was becoming nothing, and the mathematics of what could be retrieved in the time available came to zero. The cabin collapsed inward before dawn. The roof went first, sending up a shower of sparks that rose and cooled and became dark specks against the gray pre-morning sky. Then the walls, then the floor. The stove survived black and exposed, sitting in the ash like a monument to its own indestructibility. Vane came down from his cabin as fast as his lungs would allow, his face the color of a man who had been moving faster than his body could gracefully manage, and who was not going to stop for that reason. He found her sitting on a log at the edge of the clearing with Flint against her leg and the journal in her lap, watching the last of the smoke rise. He didn't say anything for a while. He sat down beside her on the log, and he breathed through the effort of the descent, and he watched the smoke with her. Then he went around to the back of the property. He was gone perhaps 20 minutes. When he came back, his face had changed from the face of a man managing grief into the face of a man managing anger, which was a different expression entirely and one she had not seen on him before. He showed her what he had found without speaking: a patch of mud near the fence line, sheltered from the worst of the summer dry by an overhang of rock where the ground was soft enough to have held impressions. Hoof prints. Several horses tied for a period and then moved. One print was distinctive, 3 nails missing in a specific configuration, creating a gap on the right side of the shoe that repeated in every impression that hoof had made. Burns' horses, Vane said. His voice was flat and even and extremely controlled. Same farrier shoes, all his animals. I'd know that print anywhere. Willa looked at the prints. She thought about the man who had stood in the clearing in his good suit with his practiced smile and his envelope of money and his patience that was not patience, but simply a longer version of the same intention. She thought about the entry in the journal from 1911. Burns sent men to burn my cabin last night. She went back into the cave. She spent the rest of that day reading. Not the sections she had already read and reread and committed to memory, but the sections she had moved past too quickly in the rush of learning the practical things. The earlier entries, the ones from before the cave, was what it had become when Fergus was young and still working out what he was building and what it meant. He had survived Burns' attack in 1911 by escaping through the second exit, a passage she had found inscribed in the journal, but not yet fully explored, a narrow channel that climbed steeply through the limestone and emerged on the ridge above. Burns' men had set fire to an earlier, simpler version of the cabin and assumed the result. Fergus had let them assume it. He had spent 3 weeks on the ridge living off the forest before descending to begin rebuilding. He had spent the following 24 years building better. Not just the cave, the understanding of how to be harder to dislodge. The water stores, the seed stores, the second exit, the careful documentation that ensured that if anything happened to him, the knowledge would survive him. He had built in anticipation of the next attack. And now the next attack had happened, and the cave was intact. The mirrors, the water channels, the stone beds, the mushroom logs, the seeds, the tools, the systems, everything that actually mattered had survived because it was underground and behind a stone door and made of materials that fire had no interest in. He was right, she thought. The cave is the fortress. She converted the third chamber into living quarters. It took 3 weeks with Vane's help and 1 afternoon of Elspeth's engineering knowledge applied to the problem of ventilation. The back chamber was the deepest and most consistently warm section of the cave system, and it was large enough 20 feet across to accommodate a sleeping platform built against the wall, a small cast-iron stove that Vane brought down from his cabin on a sledge with a chimney pipe that vented through a natural crack in the ceiling that Fergus had already identified in the journal as a potential flue. The floor was stone. The ceiling dripped. The only light was candles in the kerosene lamp, which threw shadows on the limestone walls that moved and settled and moved again. She found it beautiful. Not in the way that the hollow was beautiful on spring mornings when the light came through the trees at the right angle and the creek was high and the whole world smelled like growth. A different kind of beauty, the beauty of a thing that is exactly what it needs to be. The cave didn't pretend to be anything other than stone and darkness and the slow, constant drip of water through ancient rock. It had been here for longer than any human thought about it, and it would be here long after, and in the meantime it was hers, and it was safe, and it was where she lived. Flint adapted immediately, as was his nature. The years that followed were the years of building. She was 17 when she moved into the cave, and she was 20 when the war came, and in between those two facts she grew a farm. The terrace system she began in the spring of 1939, hauling stone from the creek bed up the slope below the cave entrance and building retaining walls that created level planting surfaces on the steep hillside. It was the hardest physical work she had ever done. Stone is heavy in a way that is not like other heavy things. It is a permanent, fundamental weight, with no give in it, no bounce, no concession. She moved it anyway, one stone at a time, up the slope into position. By the summer of 1940, she had 6 terraces. By the spring of 1941, she had 12. She planted summer crops on them, crops that needed more sun than the cave could provide, tomatoes and beans and squash, and the sweet potatoes that grew in the hillside soil, with an enthusiasm that she found almost comical given how reluctant everything else was to volunteer anything. The cave remained the winter engine. The terraces were the summer production. Together they made a complete system, and a complete system, she was learning, was something different from 2 good partial systems placed side by side. It was something that had a logic and a resilience that neither component had alone. She began delivering food to families in the hollows below. Not to Ember Hollow, not yet, not while Reverend Horn was still preaching about unnatural harvests and Mrs. Hawkins was still telling customers that the girl in the cave was something they should avoid. But to the smaller settlements further into the mountains, the collections of families that were too remote to have access to fresh food through any reasonable means for 5 or 6 months of every year. She brought greens and mushrooms and potatoes and herbs, and she asked nothing for them because the families she was bringing them to had nothing to give, and she had decided that asking for nothing was not generosity, but simply accuracy. She had more than she needed. They had less than they needed. The mathematics of this was not complicated. The first family she approached directly rather than leaving food at the edge of a yard in the dark was a woman named Vera and her husband and their 3 children. The children were the ages of children who should not look the way these children look, pale and thin, with a dullness in their eyes that Willa recognized from Fergus's journal as the specific signature of bodies that had been running on an inadequate supply of the right things for too long. "What do you want for it?" Vera said. She held the basket at arm's length slightly, as if it might contain something she didn't want to be responsible for. "Nothing," Willa said. "I grow more than I need." The suspicion didn't leave Vera's face. But her children were standing behind her legs looking at the basket with the expression of children who have not learned yet to distrust things that look good because they have not yet had enough experience of things that look good and turned out to be otherwise. Vera took the basket. A month later, her husband climbed the mountain with a bushel of dried apples from their one tree and a look on his face of a man who has been wrong about something significant and is working out how to say so without saying so. "My youngest," he said, "she was sick all winter. Couldn't keep anything down. Since she started eating the greens you brought, she's better than she's been in 2 years." He set the apples down carefully and turned to go. "I don't know what you are," he said, "but whatever you're doing up there, don't stop." Pearl Harbor happened on a Sunday in December 1941, and Willa heard about it 3 days later when Vane came down from his cabin with the expression of a man who has been sitting with news he doesn't know how to put down. The young men left. They left the hollows and the mine camps and the scrub farms that had been barely keeping families alive anyway, and they went to training camps in Georgia and Virginia and onto ships heading toward places with names that didn't sound like anywhere a person from Harlan County was supposed to go. And the ones left behind, the women and the old men and the children, discovered what it meant to be responsible for their own survival without the inadequate but real contribution of the young men who were gone. The supply lines thinned. The government was buying everything for the war effort, and what was left cost more than it had before. The railroad deprioritized civilian freight. By the summer of 1942, the general stores in the valley towns were operating on such reduced stock that buying flour required planning and luck in approximately equal measure. The summer of 1943 brought the worst drought Vane said he could remember in 50 years of paying attention to such things. Wells went dry. The creek dropped to a trickle. Crops that had been planted in hope and maintained in faith burned up in the fields, or simply stopped growing the plants, suspending their growth with the patient stubbornness of things that have survived previous droughts and know that waiting is sometimes the only response available. The cave kept producing. 55 degrees Fahrenheit unchanged by any of it. The limestone walls wept their slow moisture into the channels regardless of what was happening above. The mirrors caught what light there was and redirected it with the precision that Elspeth had helped her calibrate 2 years before. The mushrooms grew in the back chamber in their particular darkness, indifferent to drought and heat and the complicated politics of human conflict. Willa did not raise her prices. She lowered them. When families couldn't pay, which happened more frequently as the summer wore on and the desperation deepened. She gave the food away without making a ceremony of it, because making a ceremony of giving things to people who needed them was a way of taking something from them, even as you gave something. She loaded baskets before midnight and carried them down the mountain on routes she knew by feel, now paths she had walked in every season and every weather, and she left them at the doors of the families who were hungriest. She knew which ones were hungriest because she had been paying attention for 7 years and paying attention to the right things. The Hendrick family, whose children she had helped when they were young enough that scurvy had still been treatable. The Praters, whose men were all overseas. The Collinses, 8 children and a grandmother, and not enough of anything. She left the baskets in the dark and she walked back up the mountain, and she told no one because telling people was a way of changing what the giving was about, and she didn't want it to be about anything except that people were hungry and she had food. Reverend Caleb Horn came to the cave on a night in December 1943, when the first real snow of the winter had fallen and the hollow was quiet in the specific way it went quiet after fresh snowfall, as if the world had accepted a covering it had needed for a long time. Willa heard him before she saw him. The footsteps on the snow-covered path, slow and effortful, the steps of a man who had walked a long distance and was not certain he should have. She came to the cave entrance with her lantern and held it out. He was standing 10 feet from the door. He was perhaps 60, a man who had been solid once and had become gaunt in the way that grief made people gaunt, as if something essential had been withdrawn. He was wearing his good coat, the one for church occasions, which was wrong for this weather and for this errand, and which said something about the state of his thinking when he left home. His hat was in his hands. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who has been wrong about something for a long time and has recently encountered the specific misery of understanding exactly how wrong and exactly what it cost. "I know what I said from my pulpit," he said. His voice was not the voice of a man who preached. It was the voice of a man. "I know what I called you, what I called your uncle's work, what I told the people in my congregation to believe about where you came from and what was guiding your hand." He stopped. "But my son is sick. His name is Eli. He is 18 years old and he is all I have left in this world. His wife had died 3 years prior. His congregation knew this. Eli's body," Horn said, "could not fight what was in it. His immune system had been weakened by a year of not eating enough of the right things, and the infection that had taken hold in his chest was winning. The doctor said he needed fresh vegetables," Horn said. "Said there was something in them his body had run out of. Said without them, he might not." He stopped again. He did not say the word. He just stood in the snow with his hat in his hands and let the sentence's ending speak for itself. Willa looked at this man. She thought about the sermon that Vane had recounted to her, the theatrical pause, the rhetorical question the congregation assembled to hear that she was something to avoid. She thought about 9 miles of walking and an empty return. She thought about what it would feel like to say no. She thought about it for approximately as long as it takes to breathe in and breathe out. She turned and went to the cave. She moved through the planting beds without the lamp. She knew this space well enough that light was optional, and moving through the familiar dark felt like something more than navigation, felt like belonging, and she collected what she needed. Greens high in the vitamins, a body depleted by malnutrition required, mushrooms with their dense protein, root vegetables that could be made into the kind of hearty mineral-rich soup that a body trying to fight infection needed as its foundation. She loaded a basket. She came back to the entrance and she held it out. Horn looked at the basket. He looked at it the way people looked at things they had not expected to receive after having forfeited the right to expect anything. "Take it," she said. "Feed your son." He reached for the basket and then he stopped. He looked up at her with the wet eyes of a man who has arrived at a moment he did not know how to prepare for. "Why," he said, "after everything I said, after everything I did. Why would you do this?" Willa thought about it honestly. "Because he's sick," she said, "and because I have food. Those two things are the whole of it." Horn took the basket. He held it against his chest the way people held things that were more than what they appeared to be. He turned to go. Then he turned back. "I was wrong," he said. "Not about everything." Perhaps he was a man of faith, and he was not going to abandon his faith on a snow-covered mountainside. "But about this, about you, about what your uncle built and why." He walked back down the mountain through the snow. Willa stood at the cave entrance and watched him go until the dark folded around him, and there was only the sound of his footsteps, and then that too faded. Flint came to stand beside her. He put his head against her knee, and she put her hand on his head, and they stood together in the opening of the cave with the snow falling silently around the hollow, and the mountain holding them both in the particular stillness that mountains maintained, regardless of everything that happened in the small lives conducted on their slopes. She was 22 years old. She had been in the hollow for 7 years. She had grown food underground when everyone said nothing grew underground. She had survived a fire and a drought and the contempt of an entire community. She had fed families who had never thanked her and delivered food in the dark to people who hadn't known to expect it. She had built something that could not be burned. She went back inside to check the beds because checking the beds was the work, and the work was what came next. And what came next was always the thing that mattered most. Thaddeus Vane died on a Thursday morning in February of 1944 in his chair by the stove with a bowl of mushroom soup still warm on the table beside him. Willa found him when she made her morning climb to his cabin, which she had been doing every day for the past 3 months as his cough had deepened and his steps had shortened, and the fire that had always burned in his eyes had begun to bank itself down to something quieter and more considered. She pushed open his door and knew before she fully entered what the quality of the silence inside was telling her. His hands were folded in his lap. His face had the smoothness of a face that has finally stopped bracing against something. The lines of pain that had been written there by decades of coal dust and cold and solitude had released themselves in the night, and what was left was a face that she recognized as the underlying version of the one she knew, the face that had always been there beneath the effort. Flint came in beside her. He went to the old man's feet and lay down and put his head on Vane's boot and stayed there while Willa stood in the doorway and understood the full weight of what the room was holding. Under his hand, she found the letter. He had written it on the back of a feed store receipt from 1931, the paper worn soft from being handled many times as if he had written it long ago, and come back to it over the years the way you came back to things you wanted to be sure were right. The handwriting was large and slightly unsteady, the handwriting of a man who no longer wrote often, but understood the importance of this particular writing being legible. Willa, it said, you are the closest thing to family I have had in 30 years. Closer than my son who does not write. Closer than my wife who could not watch me go slow. The cave gives back what the mines took away. Not just the food, the purpose, the meaning. The sense that a life spent on a thing is not wasted if the thing is worth spending a life on. I leave you my cabin and my tools and my 40 acres that run along the ridge to the north. Use them as you see fit. Teach others what you know. And when I am gone, do not mourn too long. I have had a good ending. Not everyone gets that. Your friend Thaddeus Vane. She buried him on the south-facing hillside above the cave in the place where the morning sun fell first and held longest, where she could see from the cave entrance, on clear days, the darker rectangle of the turned earth against the winter-pale grass. She dug the grave herself, working in the February cold, until her hands were stiff and her shoulders burned, because digging it herself was the last useful thing she could do for him, and she was not going to delegate it. She set a fieldstone at the head and carved his name with a cold chisel, working slowly because the stone deserved to be done right, and she had time to do it right. Thaddeus Vane, 1860 to 1944. He knew what mattered. She planted rosemary at the base of the stone. Fergus's journal said rosemary was for remembrance. She did not need the reminder. She was not the kind of person who forgot the people who had believed in her, but the planting felt like a proper acknowledgement of something that words were insufficient for. She went back to the cave and she checked the planting beds and she adjusted the mirror array for the low winter angle, and she went on because going on was the work, and the work was what remained, and Vane himself would have been irritated by any prolonged interruption of it. The spring of 1945 was the first spring of peace. It arrived without drama in the hollow. The way seasons always arrive there, not all at once, but gradually, the redbud first, and then the service tree, and then the dogwood, and then the riot of everything else coming in its own time and its own order, regardless of what was happening in the world below. The young men who came back different, and some of them didn't come back at all, and the ones who had stayed behind had a different kind of weathering on them, the weathering of people who have maintained things in difficult conditions and know now what they are capable of. Willa was 24 years old in the spring of 1945. She had been in the hollow for 9 years. The cave was producing enough food to supply more than a dozen families through the winters, and the terraces above had expanded until they covered the entire south-facing slope in a system of stone walls and productive ground that could be seen from the far ridge if you knew what you were looking at. She had 30,000 seeds in storage documented in a ledger she had begun after Fergus's journal, continuing the record with the same small, precise handwriting she had developed copying his entries. She had not been to Ember Hollow since the war ended. That changed when Aldrich Byrne filed his lawsuit. The papers arrived in May of 1946 through the mail that was now delivered once a week to a box at the base of the Hollow Road. She read them at the kitchen table in Vane's old cabin, which she had moved into after his death, not because it was more comfortable than the cave, but because it had a window that faced east, and she had found at 23 that she wanted to see the mornings arrive. The lawsuit claimed that Willa Callum had obtained the property known as Shadow Hollow through irregular means, that a minor could not legally inherit real property, that the deed was improperly recorded, that her occupation of the land for the past decade was therefore invalid, and the property should revert to the county, at which point Aldrich Byrne stood ready to acquire it through proper legal channels at a price he had already communicated to the relevant county officials. He had lawyers from Lexington. He had a judge in Harlan County who had been deciding things in Byrne's favor for 15 years. He had 30 years of practice in getting what he wanted through the specific combination of patience and pressure that men of his type had refined into something close to an art form. Willa had a cave, 45 acres of hollow land, and a decade of understanding what the ground was worth to someone who knew how to work it. She sat with the lawsuit for 2 days. She read it multiple times carefully with the same attention she brought to Fergus's journal when she was learning a new technique. She was looking for the things she didn't know. The assumption that was being made about her that was incorrect, the term that was being used in a way that didn't match the reality. She found it in the language about irregular inheritance. She wrote to Pemberton. He was retired now, living in Florida, but he wrote back within a week, and his letter contained not what she expected, but something more important: the name and address of the lawyer who had handled the original estate, a man named Garrett who had continued practicing in Hazard after Pemberton's retirement. She wrote to Garrett, and then she wrote to Elspeth Norris, because Elspeth had a way of finding things in documents and offices that others missed, not because she was cleverer than anyone else, but because she was more patient and more systematic and less willing to accept that the answer wasn't there, simply because it hadn't presented itself in the first 3 places she looked. Elspeth spent 2 weeks going through the files that Pemberton and Garrett had maintained on the Fergus Callum estate. She went through them in the order they had been filed, which was not the order anyone had assembled. Them, which meant she was going through years of paper in the physical sequence that time had deposited them, rather than the logical sequence that a summary would have imposed. She found the adoption document on a Wednesday afternoon in August. She came to the Hollow that Saturday, which was her regular visiting day, and she sat across from Willa at the table, and she put the document down between them without saying anything first because the document was sufficient. It was a legal adoption signed by Fergus Callum in November of 1934. Notarized, witnessed by 2 people whose names Willa didn't recognize. Filed with the state in December of 1934. Legally valid, formally executed, impossible to dispute by anyone who had not known it existed. Fergus had adopted her as his daughter and heir nearly 2 years before he died. He had never met her. He had never spoken to her. He had completed the legal process of making her his child from a hollow in the Kentucky mountains based on nothing more than the knowledge that she existed and was alone and needed someone. Willa sat with this for a long time. Then she said, was there anything else? Elspeth's expression told her the answer before she spoke. There was a second document. It had been filed with the adoption papers, but had been separated from them, at some point slipped into a different folder, either by accident or by someone who had wanted it not to be easily found alongside the adoption paperwork. Elspeth had found it in a folder labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence, 1933 to 1935, which was the kind of label that communicated that whoever had created the folder had not wanted anyone to look inside it carefully. It was a letter, dated April 1934, addressed to the Cold Creek Home for Foundling Girls, to the attention of the Director of Admissions. My name is Fergus Callum, the letter began. I am looking for a young girl currently in your care. I believe she was placed with your institution in approximately 1926 at the age of 5, following the death of her mother and the disappearance of her father. Her name at the time of placement would have been Willa Callum. I am her uncle. I have only recently been able to locate information about her situation, and I am writing to inquire whether she might be interested in leaving your institution to come and live with me and to learn the work I have been doing here for the past 40 years. I am not a wealthy man, but I have a home, and I have something worth teaching, and I believe from everything I know about this child's situation that she is the kind of person who would benefit from being somewhere that values what she is rather than punishing her for it. Please respond at your earliest convenience. The letter was signed Fergus Callum and dated April 14th, 1934. Beneath it, paper-clipped, was a note in different handwriting. Smaller, neater, the handwriting of a man who was careful with official documents. It said, "Payment received from A. Byrne, $100, letter not delivered. Response sent declining further correspondence." It was signed S. Pruitt. Willa read it twice. Then she put it face down on the table and she sat very still for a long time. And she looked at the window that faced east and at the morning light coming through it, which was gold. The way morning light in the hollow was gold. In August, particular, in specific, in the color of something she had been looking at every morning for 3 years and would look at for the rest of her life. In April of 1934, she had been 12 years old. She had been at Cold Creek for 6 years. She had been reading books by moonlight and asking questions that Pruitt called dangerous, and looking at the world with the patient, careful attention that was simply how she saw and had never been able to stop doing, regardless of what it cost her. And in April of 1934, a man she had never met had written a letter that would have changed everything, had written it carefully and formally, and sent it through proper channels to the proper person, had included in it the thing she most needed to hear, which was not a promise of wealth or comfort or easy things, but simply the recognition that what she was had value somewhere, that there was a place in the world where being exactly who she was would not be punished. Silas Pruitt had received that letter. Silas Pruitt, who had stood in front of 23 girls and delivered his verdict, a hole in the ground for the girl nobody wanted, had already known at that moment that someone wanted her, had already known that someone had written to claim her, had already cashed the check that had been offered to make sure she stayed exactly where she was unclaimed and unaware. She had spent 2 more years at Cold Creek after that letter arrived. 2 years that she could have spent here learning from her uncle while he was still alive to teach hearing his voice instead of only reading his words, watching his hands as he worked the cave he had spent 44 years building. She could have known him. She could have sat on the porch with him in the evenings and listened to him talk about plants and minerals and underground water systems and the stubborn patient work of proving that the conventional wisdom was wrong. She could have had a father. Pruitt had taken that. He had taken it for $100, which was the price he had put on 2 years of her life and everything that might have grown from them. She picked up the letter and she put it in the box where she kept the documents that mattered. Then she wrote to Garrett in Hazard and told him what Elspeth had found. The trial was held in October of 1946 in the courthouse in Harlan. The judge had been brought from another county because the judge in Harlan County had a relationship with Aldrich Byrne that the State Bar Association had finally decided was worth examining, a development that had come too late to undo a great deal, but was not in this case too late to matter. Byrne had his lawyers from Lexington, 3 of them in suits that fit the way suits fit when you could afford the right tailor. He sat at his table with the posture of a man who has been the most powerful person in every room he has entered for 30 years and has accordingly stopped accounting for the possibility of other outcomes. Willa sat at her table with Garrett, who was not impressive to look at, a small man with ink-stained fingers and the patient manner of someone who had been reading documents since before she was born, but who had read every piece of paper in the Shadow Hollow estate file and understood exactly what they added up to. The gallery was full. She had not expected the gallery to be full. She had expected the Hollow in Harlan County in October 1946 to produce a modest audience for a land dispute involving a girl who had been growing vegetables in a cave for 10 years. She had not accounted for the accumulation of 10 years of baskets left at dark doorways, 10 years of greens delivered to families who had not been able to afford to ask 10 years of a system operating in a hollow that people had been traveling to and learning from and taking home and replicating in their own ground. They came from the hollows and the coal camps and the small settlements scattered through the mountains, and they filled the gallery of the Harlan County Courthouse until the bailiff had to ask people to stop coming in. Burns' lawyers presented their case. The property had been improperly conveyed. A minor could not inherit. The deed was irregular. They spoke for a long time in the confident, smooth language of people who had been paid to make complicated things seem simple, and simple things seem complicated, and they were good at their work. Then Garrett presented his, the adoption document, the letter, the note in Pruitt's handwriting, the record of the $100 payment, the adoption of Willa Callum as Fergus Callum's legal daughter and heir, executed properly and filed with the state 2 years before his death, making her the legitimate inheritor of everything he owned. And then Reverend Caleb Horn stood up and asked to speak. He was not on Garrett's witness list. The request caused a brief procedural confusion that the judge resolved by simply allowing it because the judge had been reading the documents Garrett had submitted and had arrived at conclusions about the nature of this case that made him willing to extend accommodations he might not have extended otherwise. Horn stood at the front of the room in his good coat, which he had taken better care of since the winter of 1943, and he looked at the room and then at Willa, and then at the room again. "I owe this court a statement," he said. He had been told, he explained, by people he had trusted that the work being done in Shadow Hollow was something to fear. He had repeated what he was told from his pulpit with the full authority of his position and his voice, and the people who sat in his pews every Sunday had believed him because that was what he had trained them to do. He had called the girl in the cave a danger. He had called what she grew in the dark an unnatural harvest. He had done this without once visiting the hollow to see for himself, which was the kind of error that a man of God had less excuse for than anyone. And then he said his son had been dying. The room was very quiet, and I went to that hollow on a night in December with my hat in my hands, he said, and I asked for help from the person I had spent 3 years telling my congregation to avoid. He paused, and she gave it. He looked at the lawyers from Lexington. She gave it, he said, without asking for anything in return. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement that I had been wrong, not money. She just gave. Because her neighbor's child was sick, and she had what the child needed. He let this sit in the air for a moment. That, he said, is the whole of it. He sat down. The judge ruled in Willa's favor on a Friday afternoon in October with the specific comprehensive language of a judge who wanted there to be no room for further interpretation. The property was hers legally and permanently. The adoption was valid and had been valid since 1934. The deed was properly recorded. Any future challenges to her ownership of Shadow Hollow would be met with this ruling as precedent, and the ruling was intended to be as precedent-proof as he could make it. Aldrich Burns sat at his table and did not move when the ruling was read. He did not change his expression. He was a man who had spent his life arranging his face into the shape that was most useful in any given situation, and the situation had not yet presented him with a shape that acknowledged defeat, so he arranged it instead into the shape of a man who was already planning what came next. What came next, as it happened, was very little. He died 3 years later of a heart attack in his office in Harlan, and the people who gathered to observe the fact of his death were mostly people who had an interest in knowing who would inherit his operations, which was a different thing from mourning him. His son sold the mines within a year and moved somewhere that was not Kentucky and did not look back. The mines closed. The tunnels filled with water. The mountain kept its secrets. Willa walked out of the courthouse into the October afternoon and stood for a moment on the stone steps, feeling the cool air and the particular quality of light that October produced in these mountains, amber and slanted and honest in the way of light that has stopped pretending it's anything other than what it is. Elspeth stood beside her. "The hollow is yours," Elspeth said. "It always was," Willa said. Pruitt came to the hollow in the spring of 1948. She saw him from the cave entrance when he appeared at the far end of the hollow road, walking slowly the walk of a man who has traveled a considerable distance and is not certain of his welcome at the destination. He was older than she remembered, though it had been 12 years, and she had changed entirely in 12 years. So older was perhaps not the right word. He was the version of himself that 12 years had made, and it was a different version than the one she had carried in her memory. He stopped at the edge of the property. He did not come further. He stood there with his hat in his hands, and it struck her, seeing this, that the hat in the hands was something she associated now with the act of coming to ask something that you know you have forfeited the right to ask, and that this was probably not a coincidence, and he waited. Flint stood beside her at the cave entrance. He looked at the man in the road with a steadiness that was not aggression, but was not welcome either. She walked down to meet him. He looked at the hollow as she approached at the cave entrance, with its weathered door at the terraces on the slope, with the early spring plantings at the cabin, with its repaired roof and its east-facing window that she had added herself 2 years after moving in because she had found she could not do without it. "Your uncle wrote to me," he said. His voice was the same voice she remembered, the voice that had named her a fool and a foundling and a nothing, but it had something in it now that the old voice had not had, something that had been added by the intervening years and could not be removed. "He wrote to me in April of 1934. He wanted to find you." She waited. "I took Burns' money," he said. $100. He looked at her with the direct, effortful honesty of a man who has decided to look at what he did and not look away from it. "I told myself you were just another orphan, that there were too many of you and not enough of anything else, and that one more arrangement to keep one more girl in one more institution was not a moral failure, but just the way things worked." He stopped. "But it was a moral failure," he said. "A complete one." The hollow was quiet around them. The creek made its sound at the bottom of the slope. The spring birds were doing what spring birds did, which was to assert their presence in the world with more noise than seemed strictly necessary. "I stole 2 years of your life," Pruitt said. 2 years you could have spent here learning from your uncle while he was alive to teach you. 2 years of a relationship that could not be recovered once he died. He steadied his voice with visible effort. "I stole the only family you might have had." Willa stood in the mild spring air, and she held all of this, the $100 and the 2 years, and the letter that had been paperclipped to its response and filed in a folder labeled miscellaneous. And she felt the weight of it, the way you felt the weight of stone, specific and permanent, not going anywhere regardless of what you thought about it. She thought about what Fergus had written in his journal in 1911 after Byrne had burned his first cabin. "He will try again. Byrne always tries again. But the cave cannot burn. The stone has stood for 1,000,000 years. Stay. Grow." She thought about Thaddeus Vane and the fuel store receipt he had written his will on and the rosemary growing over his grave. She thought about Reverend Horn standing in the December snow with his hat in his hands. She thought about what it cost to carry something for a long time. Not the cost to the thing being carried. Stone didn't mind being carried. It simply was what it was, regardless. But the cost to the person doing the carrying. The way weight accumulated. The way the muscles of the spirit, like the muscles of the body, could exhaust themselves in the sustained effort of holding something heavy in an elevated position with no particular destination in sight. She was done being exhausted by this. "I forgive you," she said. Pruitt's face did something complicated. Not relief, it was too early for relief, and relief might not have been the right word even eventually. Something more like the physical sensation of a very long-held breath being released. "Why," he said, quietly, "after everything, why would you?" "Because carrying anger," she said, "is like carrying stones uphill. You exhaust yourself and you never reach the top. I have been carrying too much for too long, and I want to put it down." She went inside and she came back with a basket. Greens from the beds early spring. Greens the first real harvest of the new season. Mushrooms from the back chamber. The dried herbs she had been growing since she was 16 years old. She held the basket out. He took it with both hands and he held it for a moment without speaking. She heard years later from a woman in the hollow who had heard from a cousin in Louisville that Silas Pruitt had spent the last years of his life volunteering at an orphanage on the edge of the city. That he had become known there for his advocacy for the children's education, for his insistence that they be taught mathematics beyond the 6th grade level, for his habit of asking each new child what they were curious about and then finding them a book that addressed the question. That he had died at 78 in a room full of children who had known him as the man who listened. She did not know if this made up for anything. She did not require it to. Owen Aldous arrived in September of 1949 on a Tuesday morning when the first color was coming into the leaves at the high elevation and the air had that particular crispness that meant summer was conducting its orderly withdrawal. He was 28 years old, a compact man with the kind of hands that spent most of their time doing useful things and showed it, and he had the manner of someone who came from a family that valued practical knowledge and had accordingly developed a reflex of paying attention to how things actually worked rather than how they were supposed to work. He had heard about the hollow through a contact at the State Agricultural Extension Service. Elspeth had submitted a report 2 years earlier, a careful technical document that had made the rounds of people who cared about such things and had produced a slow widening ripple of interest. He had driven from Charleston, which was not a short drive, and had arrived unannounced because he had decided that people who made appointments were seen differently than people who just showed up, and he wanted to see what was actually there rather than what was prepared for a visitor. He stood at the cave entrance and he looked at everything, the mirror array, the stone beds, the water channels, the mushroom logs in the back chamber, and he did not make the sound that people made when they expected something ordinary and encountered something extraordinary. He nodded. Once. Then he said, "Tell me how the water channels maintain their gradient." She told him. He asked how the mirror angles were adjusted across the seasonal arc. She showed him Fergus's calculations and Elspeth's refinements. He asked about the soil composition in the raised beds and whether she had tested for specific mineral content, and when she showed him the soil records she had been keeping for the past 8 years, he read them with the focused absorption of a man reading something that matters. He came back the following week. He came back the week after that. She noticed him the way you notice things that were consistently there, not suddenly, not in a single moment of recognition, but gradually the way you notice that a particular plant was doing well, the cumulative observation of something performing at the level it was capable of, and gradually understanding that this was what it was going to do. He was useful. This was the first and most fundamental thing. He could see what needed doing without being told. He could work alongside her without requiring direction or interruption. He had the specific quality of someone who had learned early that the most useful person in any situation was the one who asked the right questions and then got out of the way of the answers. He made her laugh. This surprised her more than anything else. She had not spent the past 13 years in the hollow having a lot to laugh about, and she had not realized that this was a deficiency until someone addressed it. He stayed through the harvest. He stayed through the first frost. By the time the second snow came, they both understood without having said it that the question of his leaving had become theoretical. They were married in the cave in September of 1950. Not in the new part, not in the comfortable section with its sleeping platform and its east-facing window that she had eventually installed in the cave wall to let the morning light in. In the first chamber, the growing chamber where Fergus's mirror array sent its redirected light across the stone beds and the water moved in its channels, and the plants were doing what plants did, which was to grow without being asked and without needing anyone's permission. The late summer tomatoes were setting their last fruit on the stakes she had built along the south wall. The herbs had gone to seed in the way they went to seed in September, the flowers fading and the seeds forming in their patient botanical sequence. The air smelled of limestone and moisture and the complex living smell of growing things that had become over 14 years the smell of home. Elspeth stood as her witness. Flint wore a length of ribbon that Owen had tied around his neck that morning, a dark blue ribbon that Flint accepted with the dignity of an animal who understood that certain human customs required participation and was prepared to offer it. He sat through the entire ceremony without moving his eyes on Willa's face, the ribbon slightly askew by the time they were done. It was a small wedding and a complete one. Flint died in December of 1952. He went in his sleep beside the stove in the cave in the place he had claimed as his own. In the first winter, she had moved in the spot where the warmth from the stone wall met the warmth from the stove in a way that produced a pocket of reliable comfort that he had identified with the precision of an animal who understood these things. She found him in the morning. He was curled in his usual position, his nose tucked under his tail, his eyes closed, his breathing stilled, somewhere in the night without ceremony or announcement. He was old. She had stopped calculating the years because the number had become irrelevant. What mattered was that he had been there for 16 years and was now not there, and the absence was a specific shape in the hollow that she felt with every step she took through the spaces he had inhabited. She buried him on the hillside next to the stone she had set for Thaddeus Vane. She chiseled his name into a piece of limestone she found in the creek bed, flat-sided and heavy, and the right size for what she wanted to say. Flint she carved, more faithful than any human I ever knew. She planted rosemary beside his grave too. because she wanted the mountain to remember him, because the mountain was the right kind of permanent for the kind of loss she was feeling, and rosemary in the mountain soil would outlast her and outlast her children, and speak for the Yao who had been the first family she made after the family she was born into had fallen apart. Owen found her there that evening, sitting beside the grave in the last of the winter light. He sat down beside her without speaking. They stayed until the dark came, and then they went back inside together, and she did not have to explain anything because he already understood. The years after Flint were full years. They had children, two daughters and a son, and then another son who arrived late and unexpected and was the image of Owen in the face and the image of something older than Owen in the eyes. Something patient and curious that she recognized from photographs of Fergus and from the mirror every morning. They named the children, all four, for the people who had shaped the hollow: Fergus for the man who had built it, Thaddeus for the man who had taught her to stay, Elspeth for the woman who had helped her see it clearly, and Vera for the woman in the hollow below who had stood in a doorway and taken a basket on faith. The teaching expanded. She began taking students formally in the early 1950s, young people from the hollows and the coal camps who had nowhere else to go and who had the specific quality that she had learned to recognize on sight, the quality of someone who looked at the world and refused to accept that this was all there was. She taught them the cave first because the cave was the foundation, and then the terraces, and then the broader principles of working with what the land actually was rather than what you wished it were. Owen died on a Tuesday in April of 1977 in the apple orchard he had planted on the eastern slope in 1953, which had become over 24 years the kind of orchard that people visited in the spring just to see the blossoms. He had been pruning branches. He had insisted on doing it himself. This was a quality they shared, the refusal to delegate work they were capable of doing, and she had learned to choose her battles about it. His heart stopped between one branch and the next cleanly and without warning, and the doctor said he had not suffered, and she chose to believe this because the alternative was not useful. She buried him on the hillside with the others, and the hillside was becoming the kind of place that had a presence to it, the gathered weight of people who had mattered in a particular piece of ground and had been returned to it. The University of Kentucky sent a team in the spring of 1978. They came with instruments and graduate students and the specific energy of people who have been told that something remarkable exists and are arriving to determine whether the remarkability is real or a matter of regional legend inflated by years of retelling. They were polite and they were thorough, and they spent 3 full days in the cave with their measuring equipment. Their instruments confirmed everything. The temperature stability. The light efficiency which their calculations showed was significantly superior to any comparable controlled environment system they had studied. The mineral supplementation from the limestone water channels, which they identified as providing a natural fertilizer profile that no commercial system had yet replicated at comparable cost. The companion planting relationships between species in the cave beds that had been producing consistent yields for 40 years. One of the professors, a young man with the excited manner of someone who has not yet learned to conceal his enthusiasm in professional settings, told her that the principles underlying the cave's operation were identical to principles that were currently being studied for potential application to food production in space on the moon and possibly beyond. That the problem of growing food in enclosed environments with limited and redirected light, which her uncle had solved empirically in a Kentucky hollow in the late 19th century, was the same problem that scientists were now spending considerable money to address. She listened to this carefully. She said, "My uncle worked it out by watching what happened when he tried things and adjusting." The professor said that this was in fact the foundation of scientific method. She said he didn't have a laboratory. The professor said that some of the most important scientific work had been done without one. They asked to take the journal back to the university for preservation and study. She said no. She said it without apology and without explanation because the explanation was simple, and she did not feel that simple things required extended justification. The journal belonged here. It had been written here, and it had stayed here through 44 years of Fergus and 10 years of just the journal before her, and 30 more years of her tending it alongside what it described. It was not an artifact to be studied. It was a working document in an ongoing project. They built a glass case for it at the cave entrance, which she agreed to because the case protected it from moisture and handling while allowing it to be read by anyone who came. The first page was visible through the glass when you approached the cave door. The words on the first page were the words she had read in a cold cabin in March of 1936, sitting at a table in a place that was barely standing, with flint pressed against her leg and the mountain pressing in from all sides. They will tell you that nothing grows in the dark. They are wrong. The dark is where all seeds begin. In the autumn of 1980, on a September afternoon when the leaves were turning at the high elevations and the hollow held the particular amber light that September produced there, Willa Callum sat on the porch of the cabin that had been Vane's and looked out at the hollow that had been Fergus's and was now hers and would eventually be other people's, in ways she was in the process of arranging. She was 59 years old. She had been in this hollow for 44 years, which was exactly as long as Fergus had been in it when he died, a symmetry she had noticed without attaching meaning to it, beyond the meaning of the number itself, which was a life is enough time to do something worth doing. The cave entrance was visible from where she sat, the weathered door standing open the way it stood open every morning until the light failed. Inside, a group of students she had taken on this season were checking the beds and adjusting the mirrors and recording observations in the ledger that continued Fergus's journal across decades she had not expected when she started. She could hear them through the open door. Their voices, not the words, but the sound of young people engaged with something that was requiring their full attention, which was a sound she had been hearing in this hollow for 30 years and still found each time quietly remarkable. The sound of someone becoming who they were going to be. Footsteps on the path from the cave entrance. Rapid light, the footsteps of a child who has found something and is bringing it to someone who will understand its importance. She turned. Her grandson Declan was 8 years old and had her eyes, which meant he had Fergus's eyes, which meant he had the eyes that saw what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there. A quality that had cost various members of her family various things across the generations, and that she would not have traded for anything. He was covered in limestone dust, in soil, in the specific expression of someone who has made a discovery they cannot entirely account for. "Grandma," he said, his voice was loud with the urgency of it, "there's something growing in the very back, way back where no light reaches at all. I checked the lamp and it reaches back about 40 feet, but this is further than that past where the lamp goes. And something is growing back there." She looked at him. "There always is," she said. He stared at her, waiting for more. "The dark," she said, "is where all seeds begin." He thought about this with the serious concentration of a child who is accustomed to being given real answers to real questions and is therefore prepared to do the work of understanding them. "Can I go back and look at it more?" he asked. "Go," she said. He turned and ran back toward the cave with the velocity of a child who has been given permission for something they intended to do anyway. His feet finding the familiar path without looking, because he had been walking this path since before he could walk it without falling, and now it was part of him. The way all frequently walked paths became part of the body that walked them. She watched him disappear through the cave door. The hollow was quiet around her in the specific way of September afternoons, the insect noise settling into something slower as the season turned the creek audible below the first yellow, showing at the tips of the hickory on the south ridge. She thought about a Tuesday morning in March of 1936 and a letter read aloud in a cold room and 23 voices laughing at a hole in the ground. She thought about a note folded twice and tucked beneath a lawyer's letter, the handwriting of a man who had been writing against time and knew it. She thought about a dog in a ditch and a key in a rusted lock and the sound a cave door made when it opened for the first time in years. She thought about a head of pale lettuce held in both hands in a cave in January and the feeling that had come with it. Not joy, but the presence of herself, which had been absent for so long that its return was nearly overwhelming. She thought about Fergus, who had spent 44 years building something in the dark that the world said was impossible, and who had known enough to understand that the work would not end with him. She thought about all the seeds that had been planted in this hollow across all those years, in the stone beds and in the terraces, and in the students who had come and learned and carried what they learned to other hollows and other mountains and other places that the world had decided were too difficult or too remote or too far from ordinary expectation to be worth the effort. The seeds didn't know any of that. Seeds were not troubled by expectation. They were simply what they were waiting in the dark for the conditions that would allow them to become what they were capable of becoming, patient, in the way of things that understand that patience is not passivity, but a kind of readiness, a sustained alertness for the moment when the conditions were right and everything that had been waiting could begin. The cave was still there. The mirrors still caught the light and sent it where light had no business going. The water still moved through its stone channels, the limestone still releasing its minerals into the slow current, feeding the plants and the people who tended them and would tend them long after today. Her grandson was in there now, in the deepest dark of the back chamber, looking at something that was growing where nothing was supposed to be able to grow. And she was here on the porch in the amber September light, having spent 44 years proving the same thing her uncle had spent 44 years proving before her, that the dark was not an obstacle, that the dark was where everything began, that the people who told you nothing could grow in the absence of light were people who had never bothered to plant anything in check. The work was still there. It would always be still there. That was the nature of it. You did not finish work like this. You simply did it until you couldn't, and then someone else picked it up and continued, and the work went on in the hands of people who had learned it from you, who would teach it to people who would learn it from them, who would carry it forward into a future that neither you nor they could see, but that the work itself, patient and ongoing, was always already building toward. She sat on the porch in the September afternoon, and she listened to the sound of her grandson's voice far back in the cave, calling out to someone she couldn't hear, excited, specific, the voice of someone who has found something and is not going to stop looking at it until he understands what it is. There always is, she had told him. The dark is where all seeds begin. She had been saying this in one form or another for 44 years to students and to strangers and to the families in the hollows below and to the researchers with their instruments and their notebooks and their questions about lunar agriculture. And she had been right every time, which was not a record she had sought and not one she intended to be precious about, because being right about something was only the first step. The second step was doing the work. She got up from the porch chair and she walked toward the cave where her grandson was waiting to show her what he had found in the dark.